Okay, this is chapter 15, call this part 2. Still dealing with monopoly, but it's actually more broadly applicable. This presentation is going to cover sort of a crash course in antitrust. And we're going to talk about the laws that prevent monopoly power from developing, some of the practical considerations of how to apply those laws, and then we're going to talk about merger analysis. As it often happens, antitrust law pops up in the news when firms want to merge together. People are worried about monopolies, so that's why we're going to stick it in this chapter. Okay, let's start out with the laws. Antitrust law is really just competition law. It's about preserving competition. The bedrock of the U.S. system is the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act. The Sherman Act was the first piece of legislation, and it was passed in response to collusive behavior that was popping up in the late 1800s. Firms were actively fixing prices and quantities. You can think about this almost like a cartel. And there were also a few big firms that had taken over entire industries. You might have heard of the Rockefellers. They were in control of oil. Carnegie, by the end of the century, was more or less in control of steel. These folks were often referred to as robber barons. The public was a little upset about the monopoly power that was developing, and the Sherman Act came in response. The Sherman Act actually outlawed attempts to monopolize, and this shows up in Section 2 of the law, and it also made it illegal to restrain trade. So what they were worried about was people who were actively trying to fix prices and quantities. They were trying to prevent competition. And these laws have evolved over time. I just want to give you a brief flavor of them now. The Sherman Act, despite its prohibition on monopolizing and restraining trade, was actually silent about firms merging together. So if they couldn't form cartel-like arrangements, then maybe we'll just buy each other out until there's only one firm. This, of course, is really problematic. So in response to a wave of mergers that kicked off, the Clayton Act was actually passed. And the Clayton Act tries to tighten up the Sherman Act. It names some behaviors that are problematic, but the one that we're going to focus mostly on is it tried to regulate mergers. It wasn't okay to just merge your way into a monopoly, and nowadays this is represented in Section 7 of that law. These are the two major laws. I'll give you a little bit more flavor on them in the upcoming slides. Before we get into some of the specifics of the laws, though, or how they're enforced, I want you to actually think about the difference between passing a law and enforcing it. You can pass a law, but if it doesn't have any teeth, there's no one who's actually going to make sure that people obey it. It doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. In other words, it's one thing to pass a law. It's quite another to uphold it. The government nowadays relies on the Department of Justice, Antitrust Division, and the Federal Trade Commission to decide when to prosecute people for violating the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act. The problem is that these folks can't keep track of every single firm in the United States, so they've got to find a way to set priorities. They all have very realistic constraints like staff and budget. And some presidential administrations have been very, very stingy because they don't value regulation. So they've gutted some of these folks at times and left them short-handed. Without straying too far off track, I want you to realize that even in the best of times, these agencies have essentially got to figure out who to pay attention to if they're worried about protecting competition. If you take a common sense approach, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to waste resources monitoring fruit stands or nail salons. Why not? Market structure, essentially. These are very competitive industries by the characteristics that we're seeing. You're probably not going to worry about monopoly power in those areas or one firm buying out another firm. So who are you going to pay attention to? You're going to pay attention to big firms, firms with significant market power. It really matters if big firms merge together. It also is really, really easy sometimes for big firms to start to use their position to squeeze out smaller firms. So is it a sin to be big in and of itself? Actually, no. From the early 1900s, there was a doctrine in place called the rule of reason. And essentially, if you got to a large position, perhaps even a monopoly, but you did it through fair competitive practices, they tended to let you slide on that. Now in the 50s and 60s, they started to actually break up some monopolies just based on size itself. Alcoa is probably the most famous example. Alcoa was a fabulous aluminum firm that basically monopolized all of aluminum because they were just that good. They got broken up and split into a bunch of different pieces in order to increase competition. But a lot of folks look at that and they're sort of like, it doesn't seem quite right. These folks started to influence the way that the law was interpreted, and it led to an overall increase in the value of performance. You can think about this as a firm's behavior, essentially. What are they actually doing in terms of price and quantity, right? Did they get there through fair practice? Over time, the modern antitrust division and the FTC are really starting to use structure to try to figure out who to pay attention to. But just because you're big doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be broken up. What they're worried about is how you're performing. What is the actual behavior of those firms? The same kind of logic applies nowadays for merger analysis. It might be okay for two big firms to merge if, in fact, they behave in a way that's going to be beneficial for society.
Okay, so how does application of these laws actually work? The spirit of antitrust is really about protecting competition. The Sherman Act is invoked when they're worried about firm behavior or agreements between firms. If two firms that are competitors make an agreement, that's oftentimes very, very scary because if they're doing any kind of price fixing or bid rigging or anything like that, cartel-like activity, it's a complete restraint of trade and it is per se illegal. Per se means the fact that they tried to restrain trade at all makes it illegal. Doesn't even matter if they're successful. And those are the sort of hot button issues. Vertical agreements up and down the supply chain between input providers, producers, and retailers, these are often no problem as long as they don't destroy competition. Rule of reason analysis would guide this. As far as the Sherman Act outlawing the attempt to monopolize, the DOJ is primarily concerned with firms that are abusing a dominant position. So Microsoft was alleged to be using their dominant position in operating systems to punish PC manufacturers that were making PCs that had any other kind of operating system. To the extent that that behavior was going on, they would have been abusing a dominant position in order to prevent competition from, say, like a Linux or some other type of operating system. If firms are using their position to prevent competition, this is an abuse of a dominant position. This is going to draw the attention of the authorities. When the Clayton Act is invoked, more often than not, it's about mergers. And they're trying to figure out whether or not mergers are going to be allowed. Is it problematic if two firms get together and one buys the other one out? Well, if they're competitors, yeah, it has a tendency to be more problematic. It depends on the size of those firms. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But horizontal mergers directly destroy competition. The real question is there still enough firms around that competition's healthy? Horizontal mergers attract a lot of attention, particularly amongst big firms in concentrated industries. Vertical mergers, on the other hand, oftentimes don't attract much attention at all. The only time that they really do is if they're tying up a critical resource that other firms are going to need, because that, of course, is going to create a monopoly over time. Another thing that can be problematic is if you have a merger that makes a firm large enough that you get yourselves into price leadership or tacit collusion being more possible. If that's the case, it leads to less competitive outcomes, and the government may have an interest in preventing that merger. So let's go real quickly through merger analysis. I want to make sure that you've read your chapter. The merger guidelines based on the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index are listed in your textbook. You can think about the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index and the merger guidelines as being based on structure. It's telling firms when they're getting big enough that the government is likely to pay attention to any kind of merger activity. That being said, structure alone is oftentimes not enough for the government to stand in the way. What they're going to want to look at is performance, or likely performance, after the merger. In order to start figuring this out, they're going to go through a merger analysis, and the four things that the DOJ and the FTC currently give the most attention to are market definition, barriers to entry, competitive effects, and efficiencies. These bottom two are strictly about performance. The first two are fairly obvious. In order for you to start figuring out how much market power someone has, you have to figure out who that firm competes with. Are they competing locally, regionally, nationally, globally? What's the relevant market for consumers? If you have a small firm that is quite big locally, but firms globally can easily compete with them, then it doesn't really matter if that small local firm buys up another small local firm. Okay. Market definition is going to basically give you a sense of how much power they have. Barriers really can be reduced down to one issue. Is the market contestable? If it's easy for other folks to enter, then it's hard to get too worried about any merger, because if a firm gets large, but they still can't prevent other people from entering, other firms will enter as long as there's economic profits to be made. That seems like a competitive environment. There has to be a compelling barrier in order for the government to generally worry about any merger. Competitive effects are going to revolve around what is likely going to happen once a merger is in place. Will a merger lead to more tacit collusion? Or will it create a dominant firm that has the ability to engage in price leadership? They pick the price, everyone follows along. Really just another version of tacit collusion. Or will they make monopolization more likely? Will that one firm now have an advantage that they'll be able to essentially slowly squeeze the other firms out just by being super competitive or having better cost structure? This might be a reason to worry. Okay. The last one is efficiencies. What we're really asking about here is, once the merger's in place, is it possible that average total costs, and hence marginal costs, drop by so much that the public actually ends up better off? Would we get better P and Q outcomes with a merger in place? If you'll recall, AT&T tried to sell the government on a merger with T-Mobile based on the idea that they were going to be able to lower costs and it would be better for the public in general. The government blocked that merger because they were pretty convinced that AT&T was not going to be able to deliver on the kind of performance or behavior that would have made that merger more sensible. It more or less looked like they were trying to eliminate one of the most competitive firms that was pushing for low prices. These four things are going to guide whether or not the government decides to go to court in an effort to block a merger. Hopefully this has given you a little bit of an overview of how the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act are applied, in loose terms at least, and what some of the guiding principles are for whether or not firms are going to be allowed to merge, which of course is Section 7 of the Clayton Act.